There's a quiet power in not explaining yourself, a deeper strength in choosing not to broadcast your wounds for validation. You see, many of us have become fluent in the language of struggle. We tell our stories of pain like old lullabies, softly, repeatedly, until they put us to sleep inside the same identity that once hurt us. We mistake attention for healing, sympathy for transformation. But imagine this. You walk into a room, and before you even speak, people feel something different about you. Not because you told them how hard it's been, but because you radiate the evidence of your evolution. You carry a new energy, lighter, clearer, and unmistakably whole. I know this journey. I've lived it. I remember the days when I used to wear my problems like armor, thinking that sharing every detail would somehow set me free. But all it did was anchor me deeper into the version of myself I was trying to escape. Every retelling became a rehearsal of pain, a performance of limitation. There was a moment, quiet and private, when I stopped. I didn't tell anyone. I didn't announce it. I just chose to focus not on what happened, but on who I was becoming. It wasn't easy. The silence felt unnatural at first. But in that silence, something extraordinary happened. I began to rewire the way I thought, the way I felt, the way I showed up. And eventually the world mirrored back a version of me that no longer needed rescuing, but was instead leading. You don't have to share your scars to prove you've survived. You don't have to justify your peace by listing what it cost you. You are allowed to outgrow your past quietly and powerfully. So I offer you this challenge, not to silence your truth, but to stop identifying with the version of you that was shaped by the storm. Speak less about the pain. Live more of the healing. Let your life, not your words, become the loudest testimony of who you've decided to be. And if you're ready, start today. Start now. Without an announcement, just become. Your energy introduces you before you speak. It's not a metaphor, it's the truth. Long before a word ever leaves your mouth, people feel you. They sense something. Call it a vibe, a frequency, a presence, but it's real, and it's powerful. Walk into a room and without saying a thing, others begin to register you. Not just your clothes or your body language, but something deeper, more primal. It's an invisible signature you carry, and it's written in the language of energy. Think back to a time when you met someone new, and instantly felt drawn to them, or repelled, without knowing why. Maybe they smiled. Maybe they were polite, but something about them felt heavy, or chaotic, or hollow. You couldn't explain it, but you felt it. That's the energy I'm talking about. And it works both ways. People are picking up on yours just as much as you're picking up on theirs. Here's the part that gets uncomfortable. Your energy isn't just shaped by who you are in this moment. It's shaped by what you repeatedly think about, what you emotionally dwell in, what you've rehearsed in your mind over and over again. If you've spent weeks, months, or years replaying your pain, defending your story, or venting your frustration, that becomes your baseline frequency. Even if you don't say a word, that unresolved tension leaks into your presence. It hangs in the air around you. People might not consciously understand it, but they feel it, and they respond to it. I once met a man who was known for his intelligence, his experience, and his sharp wit, but being around him always felt exhausting. It was as if his aura carried a storm, lightning just beneath the surface. He didn't complain out loud, but his energy, his silence wasn't peaceful, it was angry, brooding. And yet he couldn't understand why people kept their distance, or why relationships always felt strained. He thought the issue was everyone else. But the truth was, he was walking into every interaction already broadcasting the weight of 100 unresolved battles. His energy introduced him, and it warned people to stay back. This happens to all of us. We carry things we don't even realize we're projecting. Pain becomes posture. Bitterness turns into tone. Fear starts to echo in the way we laugh, the way we answer simple questions, the way we hold ourselves in silence. You can say I'm fine, but if the frequency behind it is one of resentment or self-pity, people hear that instead. Words lie. Energy doesn't. So often we focus on what to say it, how to tell our story so that others understand us. But what if we spent more time shifting the energy we walk in with? What if instead of explaining ourselves, we became so aligned, so self-aware, so internally clean, that people just felt the shift? That's not about pretending. It's not about suppressing your feelings. It's about doing the inner work so you don't have to lead with your wounds anymore. Your presence becomes your message. Your calm becomes your confidence. Your stillness becomes your strength. There is no need to impress, to explain, or to prove anything. People trust energy before they trust words. When you take responsibility for the energy you carry, you start living in integrity, with the version of yourself you aspire to be. Not the version defined by what happened to you, but the version sculpted by what you've chosen to heal. And the most magnetic people are rarely the ones who talk the most. They're the ones who've learned to embody peace without needing to announce it. What you focus on, you fuel. Every thought you revisit, every story you repeat, every emotion you dwell on, it all acts like kindling for a fire that either warms you or burns you. Your attention is energy, and wherever it goes, something grows. This is not some vague motivational phrase, it's a neurological and biological truth. Your brain is constantly reshaping itself based on where your focus lands. Neurons that fire together, wire together, meaning the more you focus on a specific thought or feeling, the more dominant and automatic it becomes. Think of your mind like a garden. You don't have to plant weeds, they grow effortlessly, if left unattended. But if you constantly pull those weeds, and deliberately plant flowers, water them, and nurture them, beauty starts to take over. The problem is most people don't even realize what they're watering. Every time you sit in a loop of self-pity, anger or regret, you are feeding that emotional pattern, embedding it deeper into your biology. Your body begins to memorize the emotional state, and before long it doesn't need a trigger from the outside world. You wake up and it's already running the program. When you focus on what's missing, you deepen the sense of lack. When you focus on betrayal, you prolong the feeling of being unsafe. When you focus on the past, you deny yourself access to the present moment, where change is actually possible. Focus creates momentum. The problem is many people have given their focus over to autopilot. They assume that whatever shows up in their mind is worth thinking about, but not everything that visits your head deserves a seat at the table. There's a story I remember of a woman who had gone through a devastating breakup. Years had passed, but every morning she still started her day with the same thoughts: how he left, what she did wrong, what she wished she could take back. She told herself it was just part of healing, processing, remembering. But what she was really doing was feeding an identity rooted in loss. Her mornings weren't a fresh start, they were rehearsals of heartbreak. She couldn't move forward, not because life was holding her back, but because her focus was. She was using the present to relive the past. This is what many of us do. We think we're being realistic, or just processing, but often we're just stuck in a loop, fueling a version of ourselves we no longer want to be. Every emotion has a frequency, and when you continuously focus on problems, your body lives in that frequency. Stress becomes a baseline. Fear becomes familiar. Even when things start going right, the mind will try to pull you back to the old pattern, because that's what it knows how to sustain. But the moment you begin to shift your focus, even slightly, something in your chemistry starts to shift too. When you begin to place more attention on possibility than pain, on gratitude rather than grievance, you send new signals to the brain and body. You begin teaching yourself a new way to be. It's not denial, it's direction. You are choosing where your energy goes, and that choice has consequences. The people who create lasting change in their lives aren't the ones who avoid problems, they're the ones who refuse to let problems consume their attention. They learn to redirect their focus toward the person they're becoming, rather than the circumstances they're trying to escape. It's not a one-time decision, it's a daily discipline. You train your focus like a muscle, and at first it fights back. The old thoughts feel louder, more urgent. But over time, what you stop feeding begins to weaken, and what you nourish starts to grow. Complaining rewires the brain for suffering. Every time you speak about your problems without the intention to solve or rise above them, you reinforce the very neural pathways that keep you stuck. It feels innocent at first, just a vent, a little emotional release. Maybe you're looking for empathy, connection, or just someone to understand your pain. But over time, something deeper happens. The brain starts to associate your identity with struggle, and suffering becomes not just something you experience, but something you start to depend on. The human brain is incredibly adaptive. It's designed to become more efficient at whatever it practices. If you repeatedly practice a skill, your brain strengthens the circuits related to that skill. But the same thing happens with your emotional habits. If you continually rehearse the story of how hard things are, how unfair life is, or how you've been wronged, your brain wires itself to default to those narratives. You train it to seek out what's wrong. You teach it that safety and familiarity exist in discomfort. I once knew someone who had overcome incredible odds, abuse, financial ruin, abandonment. And yet years after their circumstances had changed, their conversations hadn't. Every interaction circled back to the same story: the pain, the betrayal, the unfairness. People stopped responding with sympathy, and instead began to withdraw. Not because they lacked compassion, but because the energy had become draining. It wasn't just the content of the story, it was the repetition. The person didn't realize they were addicted to their own suffering. That complaining had become a comfort zone, a badge of identity they didn't know how to take off. Complaining offers short-term relief, There's a kind of emotional reward system built into it. You get attention, you feel validated. Maybe someone echoes your pain, and for a moment it feels like connection. But underneath it, your body is producing stress chemicals, cortisol, adrenaline, because the brain can't tell the difference between what's happening now and what you're vividly recalling or focusing on. So you stay in a loop. You think you're processing, but you're really rehearsing. You think you're expressing yourself, but you're actually reinforcing your suffering as a part of who you are. This doesn't mean you should suppress your emotions or pretend everything is fine. There's a time for raw honesty, but there's a line between expressing and indulging. One liberates you, the other traps you. When you complain without consciousness, you condition yourself to expect pain, to look for what's wrong, to measure your life by its shortcomings. It becomes harder to see beauty, to access gratitude, to believe in possibility, not because those things don't exist, but because your brain has stopped looking for them. Think about how many conversations are built on mutual complaining. People bond over misery. They share frustration like a form of currency. But what would happen if you stopped participating? If you refused to turn your pain into performance? If instead of feeding the problem with words, you sat with it in silence until a solution began to form, not from panic but from presence? Breaking the habit of complaint isn't about forced positivity. It's about reclaiming your mental architecture. It's about refusing to let your brain run on outdated scripts. It's about building a new relationship with your inner dialogue, one where you don't reward your mind for dragging you into emotional quicksand every time something goes wrong. Because what you repeatedly say becomes what you repeatedly believe, and what you believe shapes how you feel, and how you feel defines what you allow yourself to experience. Healing begins in silence, with intention. Not in the noise of explanation, not in the endless talking about what went wrong, not in seeking validation for the pain, but in the quiet moments when you choose to meet yourself without distraction. Most people assume healing is something that happens to them with enough time or the right advice. But real healing is an active internal process. It's not loud. It's not always visible. It's personal, intentional, and often begins where the world can't see. In silence, the truth becomes harder to ignore. The distractions fall away, the roles you play for others lose their grip, and what you're left with is raw presence. Silence doesn't lie. It mirrors what's really there, your fears, your patterns, your beliefs. That's why so many avoid it. It's easier to talk about the wound than to actually feel. It's easier to intellectualize healing than to surrender to it. Silence demands that you stop performing your pain and start transforming it. There's something sacred about being alone with your thoughts and choosing not to run from them. No phone, no noise, no social media to affirm that you're right to be angry or hurt, just you and your breath. That's where awareness lives. That's where you start to notice how often your mind drifts into old scenarios, how your body still tenses up when a certain memory surfaces, how deeply embedded your reactions are. And that awareness is the beginning of real change. You can't change what you refuse to face. And you can't face anything clearly if you're drowning in constant external noise. When you add intention to that silence, it becomes a force. You begin to shift from simply sitting in discomfort to actively observing it, without judgment. You stop needing to dissect every painful memory, and instead ask yourself, who am I becoming through this? You stop feeding the story and start feeding the solution. You begin to ask better questions. Not why did this happen to me, but what can I now create because it did? I once met a woman who had survived unthinkable loss. She had every reason to be bitter, to seek pity, to talk about what she endured every chance she got. But she didn't. She rarely spoke of it at all. Instead, every morning she would sit in silence for 20 minutes. That was her ritual. No music, no prayer, just breath and stillness. She told me that at first it was unbearable. The grief was too loud. But she stayed with it, day after day. Eventually that silence became her sanctuary. Not because the pain disappeared, but because in the quiet she found something stronger than the pain herself. Her healing didn't come from venting or explaining, but from learning to be present with herself in a way that words could never replicate. The world teaches us to speak, to share, to analyze, but rarely to listen to what's beneath all of that. Silence is where you hear your own soul again. It's where intention cuts through habit. You begin to notice how often your actions are driven by fear, how many of your choices are just reactions in disguise. And from that noticing comes power. You no longer need to be ruled by unconscious programming. You can begin to choose deliberately, clearly, with alignment. Healing that begins in silence is sustainable. It's not dependent on whether others believe your story or acknowledge your pain. It's rooted in your own connection to yourself. You stop seeking approval and begin seeking alignment. You become less reactive and more reflective. The world doesn't change, but your relationship to it does. Because something inside you has shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. You don't need to explain your pain to outgrow it. The idea that healing requires a full retelling of every wound, every betrayal, every moment of suffering is a story we've been sold, and many have bought it without questioning the cost. There's this subtle pressure in our culture to make pain visible, to articulate it, justify it, give it form through words, in order for it to be valid. But growth doesn't ask for your explanation, it asks for your decision. There is a quiet evolution that happens when you stop narrating your pain and start alchemizing it. You don't need to keep describing the fire you walk through to prove that you've survived. The scars speak, but more importantly, so does your presence. Who you've become in the aftermath is more powerful than anything you could say about what caused it. Sometimes the deepest transformations happen when you choose to stop carrying your story like a shield. Not because you're pretending it didn't happen, but because you've realized you no longer need to lead with it. You no longer need people to understand how hard it was. You no longer need to revisit it in every conversation to feel seen. That's not suppression. That's sovereignty. That's what it means to reclaim your narrative. Not to erase the past, but to stop performing it. There's a difference between processing and looping. Processing is conscious, intentional, temporary. Looping is automatic, unconscious, and often a form of self-sabotage. It masquerades as healing, but really it just keeps you rooted in the version of yourself you're trying to outgrow. And often the more we explain our pain, the more we reinforce it, not just to others, but to ourselves. We memorize the emotion. We recite the narrative. We make it part of our identity. Imagine dragging a heavy suitcase behind you everywhere you go. It's filled with old memories, disappointments, losses and betrayals. You stop every so often to open it up and show someone what's inside, maybe hoping they'll understand, maybe hoping they'll carry some of the weight. But each time you open it, you reinforce its importance. You remind yourself that it defines you. And the truth is, you don't need the suitcase anymore. You've already walked through the fire. The lesson is already in your bones. You don't